But when schools use LRE as a blanket policy, whether that policy is everyone stays in Gen Ed or these students belong in separate classrooms, they skip the individualized determination part. And that's the problem.
I'm Jenny Scherson, ex-special educator turned dyslexia interventionist. It wasn't so long ago that I, too, was overwhelmed by balanced literacy versus structured literacy, education speak, and everything in between. Fast forward after many, many hours of self-driven education, and you'll see I've built a thriving dyslexia practice helping students from age 6 to 18. My specialties? Working with the quote-unquote difficult, almost always 2E, student, and breaking down the complexities of dyslexia into everyday language strategies and action steps.
You're sitting in an IEP meeting and someone says, well, we need to consider LRE. And everyone around the table nods like this makes perfect sense. Meanwhile, you're sitting there thinking, LRE? What is LRE? But you don't ask because everyone else seems to know what they're talking about and you don't want to be the one who doesn't understand. So the meeting continues. Decisions get made based on this LRE thing, and you leave still not entirely sure what just happened. If this sounds familiar, let me tell you what LRE stands for, Least Restrictive Environment. And here's why that matters. Schools use this phrase, this acronym, to make decisions about where your child receives services, what kind of support they can access, and sometimes whether they can access certain placements at all. But here's the problem. Most schools are using LRE wrong. They're treating it like a one-size-fits-all policy instead of an individualized determination. And the really interesting thing, they use it to justify completely opposite decisions depending on what's convenient for them. One parent hears, we can't pull your child out for intensive services because of LRE, meaning they have to stay in general education even when it's not working. Another parent hears, we can't include your child in general education because of LRE, meaning they need to be in a separate setting even when inclusion with supports would be appropriate. Same acronym, opposite outcomes. And in both cases, it's being used wrong. Today, we're breaking down what least restrictive environment, LRE, really means, what the law actually says, the continuum of placement options you probably didn't know existed, and why LRE is supposed to be an individualized determination, not a blanket policy that justifies whatever the school already wanted to do. Okay, so let's start with what least restrictive environment actually means according to special education law. The idea behind LRE is this. Students with disabilities should be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. Now, I need you to catch something really important in that sentence. To the maximum extent appropriate, not to the maximum extent possible, not at all costs, not as a blanket rule, appropriate. LRE means that the school should start with a general education setting and provide the support and services needed to make them successful. But, and this is critical, if the child's needs cannot be met in general education, even with supplementary aids and services, then the team considers other placement options on the continuum. It's supposed to be individualized based on your child's specific needs, their current levels, their goals, and where they can actually make meaningful progress. But here's what happens in practice. Schools use LRE as a blanket policy to justify whatever decision is most convenient for them. They'll use it to keep a struggling child in general education without appropriate supports because, quote, we have to consider LRE. Or they'll use it to deny a child access to general education class because, quote, LRE means we need to keep them in special education classes where their needs can be met. Both of these might be appropriate decisions for specific children. But the problem is when LRE becomes the justification without the individualized determination, when it's used as a policy rather than a principle. Here's what schools often don't explain. There's a continuum of placement options. LRE doesn't mean general education or separate classroom. It means there's a whole range of settings, and the team is supposed to determine which one is most appropriate for your child's specific needs. So let me walk you through what that continuum actually looks like. At one end, you'll have full-time general education with accommodations and modifications. Your child is in the regular classroom all day with support. Then you have general education with supplementary aids and services. Your child is mostly in gen ed, but they may have a one-on-one aid or assistive technology, or they leave for part of the day for specialized instruction. Then there's the resource room model. Your child spends part of their day in general education and part of the day in a smaller, more specialized setting getting intensive intervention. Then you have a separate special education classroom within a regular school. Your child is in a self-contained classroom with a special education teacher, but they're still in the same building as their peers and might participate in some general education activities like art and gym and music. Then there's a separate special education school, a school specifically designed for students with significant needs. And there are other options too, homebound instruction or residential placements for students with very specific or intensive needs. Now, the whole point of this continuum is that placement is supposed to be individualized. The team looks at where on this continuum the child's needs can be met, starting with the least restrictive option and moving along the continuum only as far as necessary. But schools will often present it like there are only two options. Either your child stays in general education or they're in a completely separate setting, like there's nothing in between. Or they'll decide based on convenience, staffing, scheduling, budget, and then use LRE to justify what they've already decided. Let me give you some examples of how this plays out, because LRE gets twisted to support completely different decisions depending on the situation. So here's scenario one. Your child is significantly behind in reading. They need intensive, systematic intervention to close the gap. You ask about pulling them out for small group instruction in a quiet space where they can get focused support. And you hear, well, we need to consider LRE. We want to keep your child in the general education classroom as much as possible. So they get push-in services that aren't really intensive enough, or brief pull-out sessions that are more about compliance than actual intervention. And they continue to fall further behind because the placement isn't appropriate for their needs. In this case, LRE is being used to mean keep them in general education no matter what, even when gen ed isn't where their needs can be met. Scenario 2. Your child has been getting intensive intervention and has made significant progress. You think they're ready to participate in some general education classes, maybe science or social studies, with accommodations. And you hear, well, we need to consider LRE. Your child needs are best met in our special education classroom where we can provide the support they need. So they stay in a separate setting even though inclusion with supports would be appropriate. Maybe it's a staffing issue. Maybe it's easier to keep all the special education students in one place, but they use LRE to justify keeping your child out of general education. In this case, LRE is being used to mean separate setting is better, even when integration would be appropriate with the right supports. Can you see what's happening? Same principle, opposite applications. And in both cases, it's being used as a blanket policy instead of an individualized determination. So what's supposed to happen? LRE is supposed to be determined individually for each child based on their specific needs. The team is supposed to ask, where on the continuum of placements can this child's IEP goals be met? Where can they make meaningful progress? Where can they access the curriculum with appropriate supports? And then, and this is important, they're supposed to provide evidence for why they're proposing that particular placement. If they're saying general education is appropriate, they should be able to explain how your child needs will be met there, what supports will be in place, how progress will be monitored. If they're saying a more restrictive placement is necessary, they should be able to explain why less restrictive options won't work, what they tried, what data shows that your child needs a different setting. It's not supposed to be, we always do it this way, or this is our district's philosophy, or we believe in full inclusion here, or even we think self-contained classrooms are better for students like yours. It's supposed to be, here's the data about your child. Here's what we've tried. Here's why we believe this placement is the least restrictive environment where your child's needs can be appropriately met. But when schools use LRE as a blanket policy, whether that policy is everyone stays in gen ed, or these students belong in separate classrooms, they skip the individualized determination part. And that's the problem. Remember that phrase from the beginning, to the maximum extent appropriate? That word appropriate is doing a lot of heavy work. And it's the word that gets conveniently forgotten when LRE is being used as a blanket policy. Appropriate means, can your child's IEP goals be met in this setting? Can they make meaningful progress? Can they access the curriculum with the supports being provided? If your child is struggling in general education and not making progress, keeping them there isn't appropriate, even if it's the least restrictive setting physically. If your child could participate successfully in general education with accommodations, but they're being kept in a separate classroom, that's not appropriate either. Even if the school thinks separate settings are better for kids with disabilities, the law doesn't say put all kids in gen ed or put kids with significant needs in separate classrooms. It says put kids in the setting where their needs can be appropriately met, with a preference for doing that alongside non-disabled peers when appropriate. When appropriate, not always, not never, when appropriate for that individual child. So what does all of this mean when you're sitting in that IEP meeting? It means when someone says, we need to consider LRE, that's not the end of the conversation. It's supposed to be the beginning of individualized determination. You can ask, how did the team determine that this placement is the least restrictive environment where my child's needs can be appropriately met? You can ask, what data are you using to make this decision? You can ask, what other placements on the continuum did you consider, and why did you determine those weren't appropriate? Because LRE isn't a rule that says always gen ed or always separate. It's a principle that says individualized placement based on the child's needs. If the school is using LRE to keep your child in a placement that isn't working, that's a misuse of the principle. If the school is using LRE to keep your child out of settings where they could be successful with supports, that's also a misuse of the principle. Either way, you have the right to ask for individualized determination that's supposed to be happening. Here's what I want you to remember. LRE equals least restrictive environment. It is supposed to be individualized. It's supposed to be about finding the placement where your child can receive an appropriate education, starting with the least restrictive option and moving along the continuum only as far as necessary for that individual child. It's not a blanket policy. It's not an always gen ed or always separate. It's not whatever is most convenient for the school. The next time someone in an IEP meeting says LRE, you know what they're talking about. You know it's an acronym. You know what it's supposed to mean, and you'll know when it's being used as an individualized determination and when it's being used as a blanket policy to justify a decision they've already made. Now, knowing what LRE means is one thing. Knowing how to respond when it's being used in an IEP meeting, knowing what questions to ask to push for that individualized determination, knowing how to advocate for that placement your child actually needs, whether that's more restrictive or less restrictive than what's being proposed, that's the work we do in Together Through Dyslexia. Because it's not enough to know the law. You need to know how to use that knowledge strategically in meetings. You need to know how to ask the questions that move the conversation from blanket policy to individual determination. You need to know how to advocate for appropriate placement without being dismissed as not understanding LRE. If you're ready to walk into IEP meetings understanding not just what these acronyms mean, but how to use that knowledge to advocate effectively for your child, I'd love to work with you. All the information about Together Through Dyslexia is in the show notes. You don't have to navigate this alone. Until next time, bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Literacy Untangled. If you loved this episode as much as I did, head on over and rate and subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you want to continue the conversation or share your takeaways, head on over to our Instagram at Literacy Untangled and comment on your favorite part. I can't wait to hang out with you again soon. Bye.